one of the great dangers that faces tech companies is, to the extent I'm right, and you do have these winner-take-all effects, particularly in aggregator-denominated sort of markets. And my argument in the antitrust case is they're not committing any crimes. This is just the way the market sort of is inevitably going to work. And, thus to address it, you need new laws as opposed to retrofitting something else. But the concern, and why we are ultimately on the same page, is what happens is when you get in that position, when you get Google and search, when you become Microsoft and operating systems, when you become, Amazon, potentially the logistics, all these sorts of things, is you begin to have the luxury of doing a bad job. Exactly. You begin to have the luxury of, focusing on lots of things that have nothing to do with your core business. You begin to have the luxury of having a gazillion quirks and benefits for your employees. You begin to have the luxury of just buying stuff and half the founders are just retired. You're just wasting money. Like you have the luxury of being poorly run.
Well, and what's tricky here is the other part of it that's concerning is that these are companies that are providing very important services to the general public. And Boeing is obviously a great example of that. But you could say the same for Google and Microsoft. I mean, this is all ultimately like American infrastructure. And so I'm glad you make that point, because sometimes I jump on here and I feel like I'm like the bleeding heart who's trying to redistribute
you are appropriately anchoring us. You're appropriately anchoring us to the big picture problem. I'm in the details, like how do you actually solve this issue? But in some respects, software is both better and worse. It's better because at the end of the day, it's better for Google to screw something up than for a Boeing airplane to fall from the sky, right? That's just a reality of software, and consumer grade software. Iteration speed matters. And if anyone actually understood how many bugs are in anything that you use, like when you ship a software product, you don't ship until you get rid of the bugs. You ship until you deem there is an acceptable number of bugs, and knowing that there's a whole bunch more you have yet to discover. And a big part of being a quality software company is having infrastructure in place and having a work process in place to continually fix stuff, because stuff's breaking constantly, right? All the time. And so software is different than hardware in that case. And in some respects, the stakes are lower. Now, you can make the case that questions of what people see online, interaction, all that spills out to the real world. But let's acknowledge there is a sequence of steps for it to impact the real world. A Boeing plane falling out of the sky, there's no sequence of steps. You're just dead. So that's number one. As far as the tech companies go, one of the problems though gets to this causal mechanism I talk about as to why you become a monopoly. There is an aspect where the old world monopolies, where you controlled the infrastructure, at least you had to put effort into your monopoly. You had to actively squeeze out the competitors. You had to actively leverage you had to kind of pay attention to maintaining your monopoly to a certain extent. To the extent these monopolies happen not by accident, but by just the nature of the internet and zero marginal costs and high liquidity and these sort of market makers that control demand come in and or stuff. You don't have to do anything. It just happens. And in some respects, we talk about, in a positive aspect, these tech companies have massive consumer benefits, or what's the consumer surpluses, where they don't charge nearly as much as the value that they're providing, even though they're astronomically sort of make so much money. Right. On the flip side, though, implicit in that is the amount of just laziness that is enabled, that is possible in that sort of aspect, is also astronomical. And it's fair to wonder to what extent, Google should be dominating AI. Google should be all these things. To what extent can any company, though, survive this largesse, can survive this lack of pressure? And this ties back to the broader U.S. question. What has happened since 1990? What has happened in that 20 to 30 years? You've had the national equivalent of a monopoly, no threats, nothing out there, just the richest country, absurdly rich, relative to all of human history and so much our parts of the world. And maybe this was all inevitable. It's the sort of like good times make weak men, make hard times sort of cycle. And that is, it's concerning, but maybe
getting kind of heavy here. No, look, I hear you, because ultimately I think the story with Boeing is that there was enough consolidation that they were just
there was so much consolidation.
Regardless.
There was two companies. Boeing and Airbuses are constrained by the number of airplanes they can make, not by demand. Exactly. As the world has gotten richer, and as you know, they're sold out for like a decade for these 737s.
What happens is that removes the incentive to compete on product, right. And ultimately, Boeing. I mean, it's funny because I started to say Google provides a really important service. Boeing provides a really important service, right. and so if Boeing has redirected its energy to financial engineering and profit extraction and lobbying and
trying to break their unions and spreading out their things.
And so financial engineering does seem to be what America has specialized in over the last 30 years, as opposed to actually making stuff. And, we mentioned the defense industrial complex. That's going to be increasingly important through the rest of this century. And so I'm not going to claim any expertise. All I can say is that from what I've read, it sounds like a lot of these same problems plague that space as well, and our capacity to produce
imagine
cost-efficient weapons.
Boeing, one of the big five, one of the big five defense contractors. At least most of their business is still sort of selling stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think's going on at the other defense contractors who have one customer sell to the government?
One buyer. Right? Yeah, exactly. So, again, a lot of parallels to America more broadly here, and let's all just try to reset the course, as it were. That's not a pilot analogy or pilot pun at the end. One bright spot, Ben, if we're talking American engineering, from CBS News, Washington resident Sean Bates tweeted on Sunday that he found an iPhone on the side of the road that was, quote, still in airplane mode with half a battery and open to a baggage claim for the plane involved in Friday's incident, Alaska Airlines ASA 1282. In a TikTok, Bates said he was out enjoying a walk when he stumbled across the iPhone. He said he was, quote, a little skeptical at first after coming across it, initially thinking that someone had thrown the device out of their car. It was still pretty clean, no scratches on it, sitting under a bush, he said, and it didn't have a screen lock on it, so I opened it up, and it was in airplane mode with travel confirmation and baggage claim for Alaska 1282. So, pretty rough week, I would imagine, for the engineers at Boeing and Spirit Aerosystems. But what a week for the hardware folks at Apple. Granted, that iPhone was probably made in China, but it held up.
I mean,
despite